April this year due to two major changes introduced by the federal government. The Migration Institute of Australia says two new visa programs may trigger the drop, and it warns communities in regions desperate for population growth could feel the biggest impact. Louise Bartok is a migration agent and she joins us now. Louise Bartok, welcome. So what evidence do you have that this is already happening, that people are being turned, potential skilled migrants are being turned off?
I think that the main thing is the intention behind the new regional visas was, as you say, to boost population growth in regional areas. But we're seeing there's no real incentive to migrants to go to those regional areas, especially because the new regional areas also include other areas that weren't previously included. So the government has announced that regional areas include everywhere else except Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So that essentially means that a migrant could move to, say, the Blue Mountains or the Central Coast because it's not part of Sydney, and they might not have that incentive to go to more of the regional, more remote areas.
Right. And so as a migration agent, have you noticed that there's already an impact being felt in the field?
I think that, the problem is that the occupation lists haven't yet been released for those regional areas. So there's a lot of unknowns at the moment. So the government has said that there's going to be 150 more occupations on the occupation list for those new regional visas, but we're yet to see what those occupations are. So there is a lot of uncertainty. But what we normally see is that skilled migrants normally come from metropolitan areas overseas. So they are used to that more metropolitan environment. So they are sort of mostly steering more still towards the capital cities or the main metropolitan areas.
And so how has the provision changed then?
So the provision has changed to include just more areas that are considered to be regional areas. So it's everywhere except...
So if someone's coming from overseas, they're a skilled migrant, they want to stay, so they're being directed to these regional areas, they've got to live there and not in the cities?
That's correct. Yeah. So once the visa's approved, they do have to live in a regional area for at least 3 years. They can't even apply for another visa in that time, even if they're eligible for it. So I guess the intention is to have people remain in the regional areas. Previously, someone could apply for a regional visa and it could be granted, but they weren't necessarily tied to that regional area. So I can see the intention behind it is to really keep skilled migrants in those regional areas. But the difference is the regional areas have broadened. So, if someone's got the option to move to the Central Coast or to Wollongong, they might choose that over going to, I guess, a more remote location like Wagga or Bathurst, those regional areas that actually need the population growth and the skilled migrants.
So do you think the government should take another look at these provisions?
I would say so. I think the intention there is to boost those really regional areas, more remote areas, rather than the more metropolitan areas. So I think that perhaps the government could look at that a bit more closely in terms of what the real definition of regional should be and what that should look like. Another thing to note is that for the employer-sponsored option for the regional areas, they are required to still pay what's called the SAF fee. So it goes to a Skilling Australians fund. So they would have to pay at least $6,000 towards employing this skilled migrant. So I'm not quite seeing the incentive for those smaller regional employers to employ skilled migrants.
So you don't mind the principle of this, but you think it needs a bit of reworking?
Perhaps. As I said, I can see the intention to build those the population growth and the economy in those regional locations.
But it might not have the desired effect.
Yeah, the incentive for the potential employers, I'm not quite seeing. Also, they might not be used to employing foreign workers traditionally. And as I said, for skilled migrants, they are mostly coming from more metropolitan cities overseas. So, whether the regional areas are going to have the infrastructure, to accommodate them, and also the jobs. So migrants are being pushed to the more regional areas, but are there going to be the jobs there for them? Often that we've seen that migrants who are highly skilled, they move to the regional areas because it might be their only option, but they're not necessarily going to get a job in their skilled area. So an engineer might have the opportunity to technically migrate to a regional area, but they might be working in a lower skilled job that's nothing to do with their qualifications.
And so do they end up going back to their country of origin rather than staying in Australia?
Potentially. Yes.
And so Australia could lose out as a result of this?
Yeah, I think so. And at the moment, so people who have studied in Australia, they've got Australian qualifications, they can normally transition to a graduate visa. Now, at the moment, the graduate visas are only granted for 2 years. And the requirement for the new regional visas is to have at least 3 years of post-qualification employment. So for those people at the moment on the graduate visas, it's not possible for them to get the 3 years because the visa's only for 2 years.
Right.
So I think that those cohorts of people are going to be prevented from transitioning to those regional visas and potentially leaving the country or trying to find other options and not necessarily going to the regional areas.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are several issues here that need to be looked at.
Yes.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Louise Bartok, thanks for coming in and having a chat to us.
Thank you.
5 people, including 2 children.